Mr. President, this has been a week that was set aside for immigration debate. But today is the first day there is any real immigration debate on the floor. It's Thursday. All week, this floor has sat mostly empty. For months, there has been preparation to be able to put immigration bills on the floor. But as of earlier this week, there was only one bill that was actually proposed to be able to put out there, and that was the president's bill, to be able to say, here is a middle ground position. After months of negotiation and the White House meeting with everybody, both sides of the aisle, the House and the Senate, the White House laid out a proposal and said, here's a middle ground. And I would tell you the White House has moved a tremendous amount in this and has dropped a tremendous number of issues. Over the course of the past several months, the White House has moved away from a lot of things. They've moved first from legal status to saying, okay, let's do citizenship. And it's not just citizenship for the 690,000 individuals that are currently in DACA, but the White House opened this up, and I agree, to 1.8 million individuals that are not only DACA students, but those that were also DACA eligible, those that did not sign up for the process but could have been eligible for it. What's interesting enough is the president even moved from President Obama's position. President Obama's position for DACA was you had to be in the country by 2007. President Trump moved that and said he will be more open to that and say you had to be in the country by the time President Obama announced the program in 2012. That was a significant concession which opened up almost 1 million more individuals into the program. The trade-off that was pretty straightforward. He had a long list of items to be able to provide border security, both interior enforcement and border security. And over the past couple of months, the president's backed up and said, okay, Democrats have said they absolutely do not want any interior enforcement of any immigration laws added in any way. So the president backed up and said, well, let's start with border security. We want to do interior enforcement in the days ahead, but let's start with border security. The president wanted to be able to address the issue of sanctuary cities. That's not addressed in this bill. He's dropped that. The president wanted to be able to deal with asylum reform. He's dropped that issue from his proposal. There's no conversation about refugees and changing how that structure would work. There's no conversation about the H-visa programs. He's dropped a lot of issues that were important to the White House and said, okay, we'll deal with those a different day. Let's limit the issues to this narrow group of 4 issues, and that's all we will deal with. And he dropped away a lot of other issues for it. Border security, dealing with citizenship for those individuals that are in DACA or DACA eligible, dealing with the issue of family migration and how that works together, and then dealing with the issue of diversity lottery. That's it. Everything else drop away. Not comprehensive, small. But border security had very clear definitions. Border security is not just a wall, and I've heard some individuals, even on this floor today, say a wall will not accomplish anything. I would say the president agrees with that. A wall by itself doesn't accomplish anything. A wall is needed in some sections of the border to be able to slow down illegal crossings, especially in urban areas where there's an urban community on both sides of the border. It's needed in those areas. But a wall by itself doesn't accomplish anything. You can go around it, you can go over it eventually. What you need is additional agents. What you need is additional enforcement authorities. What's needed is to be able to break down some of the legal loopholes. There have been some of the proposals that have come out in the last few hours that have said they want to strike a bipartisan compromise and say, okay, we'll do a wall funding and we'll do a large legalization and naturalization for individuals that are DACA and DACA eligible. That's a fair trade-off, they say. The problem is when you read the fine print of what that means. I go back to the same statement. If they say a wall doesn't accomplish anything and all they provide is really a wall and a few technical things around it, then the question remains, what's missing? What would make the difference? What would make the difference are some very basic things to be able to close legal loopholes. That's what's in the president's proposal. None of them onerous, none of them out of line. They're just dealing with the basic legal loopholes. We have to all admit, when you see the records from Department of Homeland Security and from Customs and Border Patrol, that there are individuals that cross the border, both adults and unaccompanied minors, that are coached by coyotes as they move through Mexico. When you cross the border, here's what to say. If you'll say these things, then you'll get access into the government. And they know if they say certain phrases, they're in. I would hate to say that's actually true. And it's unaddressed in any of these bipartisan compromises. I don't think it's an unrealistic expectation to say if you go around one of the barriers or even through one of the gated entrances and cross through and immediately catch someone on the other side and say the magic phrases, you're in. We have to be able to resolve that. There are some basic ways to be able to resolve it. If you come in and have a claim of credible fear or a claim of asylum and cross the border and immediately speak those words, currently you're allowed into the country for about 2 or 3 years while your trial goes through the process. Only about 30% of those are actually successful. That 30% number is significant. So what do you do to be able to resolve it? Well, why don't we add additional judges in additional courts, and instead of waiting 3 years before you have that hearing within 3 weeks? No evidence has changed in that time period. You're still allowed to have counsel, still allowed to have insight, but we actually resolve it instead of allowing people just to be able to come into the country for 3 years and tell them here's a court date and a court location to appear, and you don't know if they appear. In fact, the majority do not appear for that court date, but they're somewhere in the country in location unknown. It's not an unreasonable issue to be able to resolve that. But yet it's unresolved in any of these proposals that are coming out in these bipartisan proposals. There's no fix to be able to deal with criminal aliens or those individuals that do come that are gang members that come into the country. It's a small minority, but there are individuals, there seems to be no fix for those things at all. There's no issue on trying to deal with how we actually do the hiring process for Department of Homeland Security. If you're on the northern border in remote areas, they have requests to say we need to add additional compensation to some of these areas or additional benefits to some of these Customs and Border Patrol folks because they work in very remote areas of the border. They've asked for this year after year after year, and there's nothing addressed in the bipartisan agreement. It's just wall and saying, shouldn't that be enough? It's not. There's no issues on dealing with drugs like fentanyl and trying to be able to interdict those in the border areas. It doesn't provide any deterrence for the visa overstays. About 40% of the individuals that are illegally into the country right now came on a tourist visa or some other kind of visa into the country and just overstayed it. We've got to be able to resolve those issues as well. That seems to be an obvious issue. There's no issue on some of the things dealing with just basic statements. What do I mean by that? Well, under some of the bipartisan bills that are coming out, you prove yourself to be a DACA-eligible individual by your own verbal statement that you are eligible. No documentation is required. I think that's an obvious loophole. That if you are DACA eligible, even in fact under President Obama's proposal, if you're DACA eligible, you have to show documentation that you're DACA eligible. Yet in these new proposals, you don't. You just have to say you're eligible and suddenly you're eligible. That's a major problem. The structure of how some of the bipartisan agreements have come out also become a big issue for me because it doesn't really deal with just this 10-year. In one section of the bill, it says it's a 10-year path towards citizenship. I have no issue with that if we can do border security to have a 10-year path to citizenship. That allows us to have 10 years to deal with the basic border security things. It gives certainty to those individuals that are in the country that they are headed towards citizenship. I have absolutely no problem with that. But the bipartisan agreement that has come out doesn't do that. It says in one section a 10-year path to citizenship. In another section, it gives the recipient the opportunity to get a legal permanent residency, a green card, much faster, which then moves them into a much faster track. It's a little bit of sleight of hand to say we'll say 10 years in one part, and in another part, it's actually 5 to 7 years. I would just say what you mean. Don't try to say two different things and have two different paths. I was also interested in a change that was slipped in at the very back of the bipartisan bill that makes an enormous change into the status of every single individual in the country. Let me just read this to you, because it's being said this bill is just about a wall and just about DACA, but let me read this section to you in the back of the bill. In carrying out immigration enforcement activities, the Secretary shall prioritize available immigration enforcement resources to aliens who have been convicted of a felony, a significant misdemeanor, 3 or more misdemeanor offenses, pose a threat to national security or public safety, or are unlawfully present in the United States, and, that's an important word in there, and they arrived in the United States after June the 30th, 2018. Do you know what that says? That says that the Department of Homeland Security can't go after anyone in the country illegally that arrived here before June the 30th, 2018. In other words, the race is on. If you can get into the country and across the border before June the 30th of this year, you are in and you have amnesty. For millions, that is not about DACA, that is every single individual in the country unlawfully present. If you're in the country unlawfully present before June the 30th of this year, according to this bill, you are in until you commit a felony. As long as you don't do that, you'll never have enforcement of any type. I was stunned to be able to see that slipped into the back of the bill. Again, this was dropped last night, and we still have the opportunity to be able to go through it. But I'm quite surprised at the number of people that have pushed back on the president and have either not read his proposal or have ignored what he's really put on the table. It's really not an unreasonable proposal. It's a very straightforward, common sense proposal. And I would encourage those folks that oppose it to read it first and to see what it actually says. There's been pushback on the issue about what's called chain migration or family unification. Let me set this in context for you somewhat. Right now we have a 20-year backlog for individuals coming into the country legally. 20 years. That's an incentive not to do legal immigration. Because if you're going to wait in a line 20 years long for many, you're just not going to go through the process. Unless we reform how we do the family integration, once 2 million additional people are added to this in the 10-year time period, I have no question that we'll move from a 20-year backlog to a 25-year backlog as family members also reconnect with those individuals coming in. What happens at that point? A bad situation gets even worse in our immigration policy. The issue of family unification and the proposals that were laid out have not been partisan proposals in the past, but suddenly because President Trump put it out there, it's suddenly an unrealistic partisan proposal. May I remind everyone, this issue was also dealt with in the 2013 Gang of Eight bill that got around 70 votes in the Senate. This very similar issue of family reunification and how this would work. In 1995, during the Clinton administration, a proposal was made by Democrat House member Barbara Jordan, leading the Commission on Immigration, that made almost this exact same proposal in 1995. This is just not a partisan issue until now. But for some reason, because President Trump wants to propose it, it's an angry Republican issue. It's been a bipartisan common sense issue for a long time of how to deal with an obvious issue in our immigration reform. I would encourage my colleagues, read the bill. See what's really in it. Not what's being said in the media about it. See what's really in it. And if you have a question and a dialogue about it, let's amend it. Let's go through it. Because it is a very unique and powerful opportunity to be able to set right for those individuals that are in that DACA and DACA eligible population to finally not have limbo, but to finally have permanence. And to know that they're home in this country, where most of them have grown up. That they're not just long-term guests, they're home. This is a way to be able to resolve it. But at the same time, do what Americans have cried for a long time. Actually secure our borders. Actually start the process of reforming our immigration system in a way that makes sense for everybody, for the immigrant, for the born citizen of the United States, for the naturalized citizen, to make sure that it's fair for everyone. It's not unreasonable. In fact, it's a good idea. If it was only proposed by someone else, I think a lot of folks on both sides of the aisle would agree with it. So with that, take the politics off. Look at the policy. And let's resolve this for the future of the country. With that, Mr. President, I yield back.